Is it possible that we might find some new early Christian manuscripts? Hi, everybody. My name is Robyn Walsh. I'm a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity and part of Paths in Biblical Studies. And this question is actually piggybacking on a question that I raised in a previous video about why it's so difficult for us to date early Christian manuscripts. Now, in that video, I wasn't talking about scholarly opinion on the dates for the Gospels, for example. That's a separate issue. I was actually talking about the physical manuscripts themselves, the actual pieces of papyri, and the different strategies that scholars use to try to date those pieces of papyri to figure out when they were written, when they were copied. Again, we don't have any autograph copies of anything from the New Testament, the letters of Paul, the Gospels, nothing. So we don't have the quote unquote originals. What we have are copies of copies. And our earliest copies, and in some cases, these are just scraps of pieces of the New Testament, are dated to at best the 2nd century. And even then, scholars are sometimes divided on whether the appropriate dating is something like 2nd century, 4th century, and so forth. In other words, our physical documents are relatively late, given that we usually place the writings of the New Testament to the 1st century. So, in early 2nd century. So, given that, I wanted to talk about whether it's possible that we might someday find some earlier copies or an autograph copy. Now, I would say an autograph copy is probably out the window for a variety of reasons, including how would we know it's the autographed copy? So, let's just put that aside. Now, could we find some earlier scraps, even, or examples of New Testament writings than what we currently have? Yes, absolutely. We could. And again, there will be debate over how to date these documents using either scientific testing or techniques like paleography. So, the estimation of the date range for a document based on the handwriting style. But where might we find these documents? So I would say there are probably 3 possibilities. Number one is sort of the extreme possibility that is exceptionally like the unicorn rare example of some new documents just being found by happenstance. And so the classic example of this would be the Nag Hammadi Library, which was found in the mid 20th century, around 1945, in the Nag Hammadi region of Egypt. Why Egypt? Because it's a relatively arid climate. And so, in that kind of arid climate, an organic material like papyrus is not going to degrade as rapidly as it might outside of like a bog, somewhere in a more moist environment. So the story of Nag Hammadi and how the codices were found, there's some doubt surrounding kind of the traditional story, but in short, some Egyptian farmers were in the area, some say looking for actually dung from cows or goats or, some kind of grass eating animal to be able to burn as fuel. And they came across some old jars that contained these ancient codices, these ancient manuscripts that included things like some writings from Plato and something like the Gospel of Thomas and some other quote unquote Gnostic texts. And the thinking here, I think the scholarly opinion on this particular piece of it is pretty stable, which is that there was a regional monastery in Nag Hammadi in that general geographic region. And there was an edict that went out sometime in the 4th century saying get rid of any non-canonical texts. And so somebody at that monastery may have jarred these codices up from the monastery's library and hidden them, and then they were found. All right, you can read up on that story, or I could tell it in another video and talk about why there's some doubt around that traditional story. But that nonetheless was an ancient find, a legitimate ancient find of some, again, relatively, late manuscripts that included some Christian materials, which is, very exciting. Some of these quote unquote Gnostic texts that were found, we knew about because we had other documents that talked about them. So, for example, from the church fathers discussing gospels that were quote unquote lost, and then we found it, right? So that is fantastic. You hope for something like that, but that is exceptionally rare. Similarly, you hope to find some pieces of papyri in something like Oxyrhynchus, where it's essentially like a trash heap. Again, we're talking about northern Africa, where these things are found, a more arid climate, that maybe you could date earlier than the current pieces that we have. And indeed, there are more pieces of papyri that have been found that just haven't been documented yet. And sometimes there is some troubling history with how these things have been cataloged, stored, or sold on sometimes even the black market. If you want to know more about this, I've recommended in the past Brent Nongbri's work on God's Library, his book God's Library. I can also recommend the work of Canada Moss on the Museum of the Bible and the selling of certain manuscripts, and also the work of Jill Hicks Keaton, and Kevin Concannon on these subjects. So look them up if you want to know more about some of the drama that goes on in the antiquities market, for sure. Okay, so that is the unicorn example. Another example, and this one's more neutral, is that sometimes you have the binding of certain codices that use scraps of papyri from other sorts of documents that would have otherwise been thrown out. And there's always the hope that maybe you find some kind of codex, other kind of manuscript that has reuse going on, and that reuse could be a Christian document. There, you might even have a better chance of dating. Say that one piece of, side of the papyrus is being used for a letter, which has a date on it, or a receipt, and then on the other side, it's being used as a piece of paper for writing a copy of one of the Gospels. That would be fantastic, right? So that kind of thing could still be found, and you hope that that kind of thing could be found, but without destroying the original piece of writing. And here's where we come to the third piece that's more contentious. There's something called cartonnage masks. These are essentially, if I could just give you a baseline on this, almost like paper mache masks that people constructed of their ancestors. You might call them something like a death mask or an ancestor mask. I'm playing a little fast and loose with this, but just to give you the idea, these would have been made of essentially paper mache, so pieces of papyri, and then painted to resemble the deceased. Sometimes this resemblance is not precise, but it's there as a place marker for the person who has passed. Now, these cartonnage masks, you could, in theory, deconstruct, take apart to see the pieces of papyri that were reused in order to create the mask itself. But now you run into an ethical issue. This is supposed to be a mask representing somebody who has passed. This is essentially a memorial. It is essentially almost like you could think of it conceivably as like a grave marker of somebody who has died. So is it a worthy endeavor to destroy this kind of piece of art in itself, or this kind of memorial to the deceased in itself, in order to might be able to find a manuscript that could be earlier than the ones that we have of the New Testament? So you can see the ethical issue here, right? Do you destroy one kind of object that has its own purpose within material culture for, an evaluation of death and dying practices, of commemoration, of, regional variants and certain kinds of commemoration, and examples of ancient art? Or do you do that in the service of a different kind of endeavor? Because once you take that cartonnage mask apart, you cannot put it back together again. Now, hopefully in the future, there'll be different kinds of technology, maybe that could look at layers. I know that there's been MRI or maybe CT imaging that's been done on rolls that have been that were destroyed at, for example, Herculaneum during the volcanic eruption of Vesuvius. They're starting to figure out how to basically digitally unroll these and detect, even though they're basically carbon rocks at this point, they're able to see the layers and try to detect what these rolls actually contained. Maybe you could do that with a cartonnage mask someday. Maybe that technology will be available, and I would recommend that we wait for that. Now, I know some people would say destroy them because there's a greater purpose here in finding earlier New Testament documents. But then I would ask, why do we need them? So there's a whole other set of issues here that you can debate. But yes, the answer is yes. We could potentially conceivably find some more documents at some point, but the remaining question is always at what cost? So just some food for thought. If you're interested in these kinds of ethical issues, or the history of these kinds of archaeological finds, go over to the Biblical Studies Academy, the BSA. That's bartehrman.com/BSA learning. We have a variety of different resources over there. And we have an upcoming conference, New Insights into the New Testament. Keep an eye on this space. I'm going to start doing some more videos directly related to New Insights into the New Testament, the NINT conference that is upcoming, where we'll be talking about, among other things, the historical Jesus. So that will be sort of my theme going into the close of the summer, is debating those issues. But that conference will be taking place at the end of September, and I'll be supplying some more information on that forthcoming. But in the meantime, go over to BSA Learning. So that's bartehrman.com/BSA Learning. You can sign up for a free trial and check us out. So I hope to see you there.